A powerful U.S. Congresswoman walked into a Dallas showroom and was treated like a joke. 3 days later, she flipped the script, raising $1.3 million, exposing a hidden culture of silent discrimination and shaking the nation to its core. Her name, Jasmine Crockett. Her weapon, unshakable silence. What did they say to her? And why is that moment now being called the most dignified rebellion America's ever seen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Though this story is fictional, it stands as a tribute to the powerful ideals Jasmine Crockett represents. Courage, quiet resistance, and unwavering respect for all. The glass door slid open as Jasmine Crockett stepped into the vintage car dealership in Dallas. She wore a simple denim jacket, boots scuffed from a morning school visit, and her hair tied back with quiet precision. No entourage, no designer handbag, just intent in her stride. She wasn't there for show. She was hunting for a 1964 Lincoln Continental, a piece of history to power her scholarship campaign for underprivileged Black students. But the room didn't see purpose. It saw denim. It saw skin. Eyes tracked her with polite dismissal, smirks forming behind manicured hands. A man in a silk tie whispered, "She lost?" Another chuckled. Jasmine kept walking. Her silence was louder than their doubt. She had faced worse. She found the car in a back corner, long, black, and regal. It seemed out of place, like her, yet undeniably commanding. She moved toward it, every step sharp and measured. But the air thickened. Judgments lingered like cheap cologne. Someone muttered, "Wrong place, wrong type." She didn't flinch, didn't answer, but her spine straightened. They didn't know who she was, didn't care. All they saw was a woman who didn't belong. Jasmine stood beside the Lincoln Continental, its black body gleaming under soft track lighting. She wasn't moving much, just observing, waiting. A few employees moved through the space, none in a hurry, none looking particularly busy. Yet somehow, none of them seemed to notice her. Or maybe they did, and simply chose not to. A tall young man in a navy suit walked past her twice without so much as a glance. Another leaned on the front desk, scrolling on a tablet, and when she made eye contact, he looked right past her, like she wasn't standing there. No greeting, no smile, no offer of help, just avoidance, clean and deliberate. She shifted her weight slightly, quietly taking in the room. It was modern, open, and polished. The kind of place that sold status more than cars. On the walls, framed photos of past buyers posing with vintage Mustangs and Bentleys, all grinning in designer sunglasses. In the corner, a glass case showing off limited edition watches. Like time itself was a luxury reserved for a certain kind of person. Jasmine wasn't naive. She'd walked into places like this her whole life, sometimes in heels and a blazer, sometimes like today, in denim and boots. She knew the look, that quiet calculation, the way someone would glance once, pause just long enough to notice she didn't match the furniture, then move on. Just a few steps away, a woman wearing a bright red pantsuit walked through the door. Almost immediately, a salesman rushed over to greet her with a big smile and cheerful tone. Eager to help, Jasmine stood quietly watching. The contrast hit hard. That woman was white, well-dressed, and carried a designer handbag. And that was all it took, to be treated with respect. Then came the footsteps, measured, precise, deliberate. She didn't turn, but she heard the change in tone. A presence. From the corner of her eye, she saw him. Late 40s, clean-shaven, pressed suit, crisp tie. His gait said manager before the nameplate did. Bradley, it read, tucked into the lapel of his jacket. He didn't approach quickly. He approached like he was checking on a spill. Jasmine finally turned toward him. He stopped at a distance that wasn't rude but wasn't welcoming either. His expression was blank, professional, but not warm. His eyes moved over her in a way that wasn't obscene, but wasn't neutral. From boots to bun, he clocked everything, noted everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, but flat. "Can I help you with something?" It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't service. It was guarded, like she might be a problem. Jasmine's voice cut through the low hum of the showroom. calm, clear, and direct. "Could you tell me more about the Lincoln Continental?" she asked, eyes still on the car. Her tone was professional, measured, no hint of frustration, no sign of confrontation. She was simply asking a question. But in this room, that seemed to be enough to disrupt the order. Bradley didn't answer right away. He stood still for a moment, then tilted his head slightly, like he hadn't quite expected her to speak again. His eyes moved back to her face, then down to her jacket, then her boots. And when they returned to her eyes, something had shifted. The fake politeness was gone. He gave a short laugh, one of those thin, breathy chuckles that aren't meant to be funny. "That car," he said, drawing out the word like it was too heavy to hand over. "It's part of a very special collection, a classic, one of the cleanest models we've ever had." His voice wasn't raised, but there was a stiffness to it now. "It's not usually something people just ask about." Jasmine didn't reply, but he didn't wait for her to. "Most of the time," he continued, "we show that car to collectors, people who have a background in this kind of thing, who know what they're looking at, who understand what something like that really costs." It was a script, polished, practiced, but under every word was the same message. "You're not that kind of person." He didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. It was in his tone, in the way he said people, in the way his eyes lingered, a little too long, on her appearance, her calm posture, her silence. He didn't ask if she was a collector, didn't ask what brought her in, didn't even ask for her name, just moved straight into coded assumptions wrapped in customer service. And then came the line that made it clear. This wasn't about cars anymore. "You'd be surprised how many folks walk in here," he said, "just to take a look. You know, pass through, dream a little." He smiled then, small, tight. "But this car isn't really for that." Jasmine blinked once, slow and steady. She'd heard worse. She'd heard louder. But something about the quietness of this moment made it feel heavier. It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he said it. Like he believed it. Like it wasn't even offensive. Just obvious. She didn't answer. Didn't shift her weight. Just stood there. Gaze steady. Letting the moment reveal itself. That silence, that refusal to shrink, seemed to push something in Bradley. He moved again, slowly, but with purpose. One step to the side, then another. He stopped when he was fully in front of the car, positioning himself between her and it. He wasn't blocking it aggressively. He didn't raise his hands, or his voice, but he stood, like someone making a boundary, a quiet, physical barrier. And he folded his arms, not because he was cold, but because it was the kind of gesture men use to signal control. He didn't look at the car anymore. He looked at her. His tone shifted too. It was lower now, and less performative. "I'm not trying to be rude," he said, the way people do right before they say something dismissive. "But that car is worth more than most people make in a year. The finish, the leather, the detailing, it all requires special care." A pause, then softer. "And protection." He said the word like it carried more meaning than it should. Jasmine noticed. So did he. "You touch something like that," he added, "and if there's a scratch, well, it's a different conversation." He was still smiling, still calm, but it was the kind of calm that tells you, you're not welcome. It was a warning, dressed as professionalism, nothing loud, nothing obvious, just the steady drip of being told, "You're not wanted," without ever hearing the exact words. Jasmine didn't take a step back. She didn't need to. She could feel the pressure of what he was doing, how he used silence, posture, and policy to push her out. He hadn't said she couldn't afford the car. He hadn't told her to leave. But every movement said it for him. The message was clear. This space isn't for you. This car isn't for you. You're wasting my time. And still, she didn't flinch. She stood just as she had before. Back straight, hands relaxed at her sides, gaze unshaken. But everything had changed. Mood, the energy, the weight of the moment. Other employees across the room had started to notice. The intern at the desk paused his typing. A salesman in the far corner stopped mid-conversation and glanced over. The silence wasn't just between Jasmine and Bradley anymore. It was starting to spread. Bradley glanced around too, quickly, then turned back to her, tone clipped now. "Look, I'm just trying to help you out," he said, as if he were doing her a favor. "There are other vehicles here, great ones, more accessible, things that make more sense." He gestured vaguely behind her toward a row of sedans near the entrance. It was the final push, the polite redirection, the suggestion that she go somewhere else, where she belonged, somewhere cheaper, somewhere easier to manage. But Jasmine's silence had power, and Bradley didn't know how to handle it. Most people would have taken the hint by now, walked away, looked down, apologized for making someone like him uncomfortable. But she didn't. She stood right there, chin level, eyes calm, as if his judgment had bounced off her completely. And that unnerved him. The more composed she was, the more exposed he felt. He'd expected her to argue, or retreat, to raise her voice, or demand an explanation he could twist. Instead, she'd said nothing. That stillness challenged everything he believed about who should be standing in that showroom. His frustration had nowhere to go, so it moved through his body. Without thinking, he stepped closer. His hand came up, open-palmed, as if to gesture her aside. But it wasn't a gesture, it was force. Small maybe, but force all the same. The movement was fast and direct, like he'd done it before, like he thought he had the right, the way some people reach for a shopping cart that's in the way or move a jacket off a chair. Except she wasn't a cart, she wasn't in the way, she was a person, and he had just crossed a line. His hand aimed for her shoulder, meant to guide, to push, to make her leave without making a scene. But Jasmine reacted before he even made contact. Her arm came up in one smooth motion, firm but not rushed, and she caught his wrist midair. She didn't grip it hard. She didn't twist or shove. She just stopped it. The way you stop a door from slamming. Quiet, controlled, final. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist with a steadiness that made the whole room feel suddenly very still. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't narrow. They just locked onto his, steady, focused, unshaken. And for the first time in the entire interaction, he froze, not because of fear, but because her calm made him realize exactly what he had just done. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry. Her tone when she spoke was low, clear, measured, and impossible to ignore. "No one," she said slowly, each word sharp but controlled, "gets to look down on me or anyone just because they don't fit your standards." She wasn't defending herself. She was correcting him. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rush. It was the voice of someone who had held her ground before, in rooms with more at stake than this one. She let go of his wrist, not with force, but with the same precision she had used to stop it. And in that small, intentional gesture, she took back control of the space. Bradley stepped back, his face tightening, not in pain, but in panic. The shift in power was immediate and visible. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was exposed. His eyes flicked around the room, as if only now realizing. People had been watching. The intern behind the desk had stopped typing. One of the sales associates had stepped out from behind a car and was now frozen, pretending not to watch while very much watching. The silence wasn't private anymore. It was shared. Something had happened, and everyone felt it. Bradley opened his mouth slightly, maybe to explain, maybe to deny. But no words came out. Jasmine was still standing exactly where she'd been. She hadn't taken a single step back. Her posture hadn't changed. Her hands were now calmly by her sides again. But the message had been sent and received. He had tried to remove her with a quiet push. She had responded with quiet strength. No shouting, no threat, just presence. And that, more than anything, had shattered the power he thought he had. She glanced at him once more, long enough to hold the weight of the moment, but not long enough to linger in it. There was nothing more to prove. She had met his aggression with discipline, his prejudice with poise. She had every right to be furious, to yell, to demand accountability on the spot, but she didn't need to. Her restraint was the loudest thing in the room, and as Bradley stood there, shoulders tense, struggling to compose himself, she turned her eyes back to the car. Because this wasn't about ego. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about principle, about dignity, and about drawing a line without ever raising her voice, but not far away. Across the polished floor and behind a desk stacked with promotional brochures, a young intern sat frozen, phone held low against his chest, thumb barely touching the record button. He hadn't meant to film anything when the morning began. He was just supposed to file paperwork, shadow sales staff, maybe refill the coffee station. But the second Bradley raised his hand toward the woman who never raised her voice, instinct kicked in. Something inside him whispered, "This means something. Don't look away." So he didn't. He kept filming. From the first passive-aggressive comment to the final standoff, he captured every second. The silence, the stillness, the restraint. An hour later, sitting in the back room with his heart pounding, he uploaded the clip to Twitter. No edits, no music, just the raw footage. The caption was short, typed with shaking fingers. "She didn't yell." He tried to push her anyway. "I'll let this speak for itself." Respect is luxury. Within 15 minutes, the video had over 10,000 views. Another 30 minutes later, it had passed 100,000. And by nightfall, it had crossed 2 million, shared, stitched, reposted across every platform imaginable: TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, WhatsApp groups, news blogs. It traveled faster than the dealership could refresh its website. People weren't just watching, they were reacting. Outrage poured in, like floodwater. The world had seen this before. Different faces, different cities, but the same quiet injustice. A woman judged on sight, a man assuming authority, and a confrontation that said more about society than it did about sales. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Just a Crockett moment, respect is luxury. With See You, the video hit hard because it didn't rely on spectacle. There was no screaming match, no flipped tables, just a calm woman being treated like a threat and stopping that treatment with nothing but words and poise. That somehow made it worse, more painful, more undeniable. People didn't have to imagine what she felt. They knew it. They had lived it. The subtle, slicing tone, the looks, the policies, the sudden need to prove you belonged in spaces that should be open to everyone. Among the first to speak out were working-class Americans, delivery drivers, store clerks, warehouse workers, people who had been talked down to for years just for wearing the wrong shirt into the wrong bank. Their comments flooded the thread. "I wore coveralls into a furniture store once, and the guy told me the prices might be a bit out of reach." I'll never forget it. "She handled that better than I ever could. My hands were shaking just watching." The quiet strength, that's power. That's what respect looks like. Then came teachers, nurses, retail staff, and veterans. One former Marine wrote, "That woman held her ground with more discipline than some soldiers I trained, and she never raised her voice." That's control. That's leadership. Others followed suit. Union organizers, educators, community activists, calling the moment a reflection of what too many people still face daily. We don't need new policies. We need people to stop judging others like they own the room. By the next morning, the story was being covered by local media outlets, then national ones. The headlines varied, but the message was consistent. Congresswoman confronted at dealership. Her silence went viral. The woman who didn't move. The manager who crossed the line. Crockett moment. How one calm response sparked a firestorm. And then, the world found out who she was. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, civil rights attorney, advocate for underserved communities, longtime public servant. Suddenly, the internet gasped. The woman Bradley had tried to dismiss, who he thought didn't fit the profile, was someone who had written legislation, fought for educational equity, and spent years lifting up the very people society kept overlooking. But the true impact came not from her title, but from how she chose not to use it. She never said, "Do you know who I am?" She never pulled rank. She didn't have to. That made it worse for Bradley, because he hadn't just judged a stranger, he had judged a symbol, a woman standing in for thousands, who never had phones pointed in their direction, who never went viral, but who lived that moment every day. The public wasn't just angry, they were united. Petitions began circulating within hours, calling for an official apology, a formal investigation, and a broader conversation about discrimination in luxury spaces. Customers began canceling appointments. Local businesses pulled out of partnership contracts. Comments poured onto the dealership's Instagram account, then Yelp, then Google reviews, turning the showroom's online presence into a case study in public accountability. The general manager's name, Bradley, became a trending term, not just because of what he did, but because of what he revealed. How quietly prejudice can walk into a room wearing a suit and a smile. And still, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't post, didn't speak to reporters, didn't rush to respond, because she knew this wasn't just her story anymore. It had become something bigger. Her silence on camera had become a rallying cry. Her stillness had become a mirror, and thousands of people were looking into it, asking themselves how often they'd been on the receiving end of a moment like that. Or worse, how often they'd stood by and said nothing. It wasn't just viral, it was a reckoning. The world had already spoken. The video was everywhere. The headlines had been written. The outrage poured out. And the dealership's public apology, stiff, corporate, and half-hearted, was buried under waves of public backlash. But Jasmine hadn't said a single word. She had stayed silent through it all. And that silence became its own kind of pressure. Not revenge, not performance, just gravity. So when she returned days later, no one expected what she brought with her. She didn't come alone. She arrived just before noon. No cameras, no entourage, just a modest school bus pulling up outside the showroom. The doors hissed open, and a group of young students stepped off one by one, diverse, wide-eyed, most of them wearing secondhand backpacks and thrift store sneakers. Public school kids, some from broken homes, some walking to school each day through neighborhoods filled with closed libraries and empty grocery stores. But today, they were walking into marble floors and glass walls. They were walking into a place that once turned someone like Jasmine away. And she brought them here not to shame, but to show. Inside, the atmosphere cracked the moment she entered. Employees paused mid-task. One salesman actually froze mid-step, a tablet still in his hand. Bradley was nowhere in sight. But his shadow remained. The air was tight with unspoken questions. Jasmine walked forward, steady, each step echoing with calm control. She didn't wear a power suit. She wasn't dressed for a press conference. She wore what she always did: comfort, confidence, and clarity. The children followed close behind her, some whispering, others just taking in the polished room, the expensive cars, the cold stares. She didn't look at anyone. Not yet. She made her way straight to the car, the same Lincoln Continental, still behind the velvet rope, still polished like memory. She stopped in front of it, looked at it for a moment, then turned to face the room. Her voice was clear, soft, but it reached every corner. "I'm not here to buy a car today," she said. The room fell still. "I'm here to buy trust, and I'll be buying it from a place that knows how to treat people with respect. No dramatics, no accusations, just truth. Quiet, steady." It landed like thunder. One of the salesmen took a nervous step forward, but Jasmine held up a hand, not in anger, in control. The students behind her stood still, watching her with quiet awe. They didn't know everything that had happened, but they could feel it, the energy, the eyes on them, the tension in the room. And Jasmine, with the same voice she used to speak on congressional floors, gave them something stronger than defense. She gave them example. "These young people," she said, turning slightly to glance at them, are going to grow up in a world that constantly tells them they need to be more to be enough, more polished, more connected, more approved. But what they need is this, to see that value isn't about the car you drive, the suit you wear, or the zip code you were born in. It's about how you treat people. Period. A pause, the words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation could have been. Last time I was here, I was told, without being told, that I didn't belong, and I stayed quiet. But I'm not quiet today. Not because I want to fight, but because these kids are watching, and I need them to see that there's power in standing still and speaking when it matters. Silence, heavy, unbreakable. Then, Jasmine stepped away from the car, turned to the children and gestured toward the exit. "Let's go," she said softly. "I'll show you what real service looks like." And with that, they walked out, shoulders straighter, eyes brighter, not because they'd won, but because they saw what dignity looks like when it's tested and doesn't flinch. The silence in the bus on the way out of the showroom said everything. The kids didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They had just seen something real, something you couldn't explain in a classroom. And Jasmine, seated near the front, kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The car wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was showing those students that dignity isn't a luxury. It's a right, one that had to be defended, even in quiet ways. So she took them somewhere else, somewhere unexpected, not to another showroom with polished glass and chrome finishes, but to a small, weathered garage on the edge of town, a place that didn't advertise status, but lived by service. It sat beside a gravel lot, the signage old and hand-painted, Sam's Auto and Restoration, the kind of place that looked forgotten by time. Rusted fenders leaned against the side of the building, like fallen soldiers. An American flag waved quietly above the door, worn but still proud. The moment the bus doors opened, the smell of oil and steel drifted in. Jasmine stepped down first, the kids following close behind, uncertain, but curious. This wasn't the world of marble floors and velvet ropes. It was real, gritty, honest, and waiting at the door was a man in his late 60s, gray-bearded, denim shirt stained from years of labor. One hand resting lightly on his belt, his posture was straight, not from arrogance, but from years of training. His name was Sam Thatcher, a former Marine, a mechanic, and a father who had buried his only son after Iraq. He extended his hand before Jasmine could speak. "You must be Congresswoman Crockett," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "Heard what happened. Can't say I'm surprised, but I'm damn glad you walked out." His handshake was firm, not performative. Jasmine smiled. "I didn't walk out," she replied. "I walked through." Sam looked past her at the students, nodded once, then waved them all inside. "Come on in. Don't mind the mess. This place ain't pretty, but what we build here lasts." The inside of the garage was cluttered, but alive. Tools lined the walls. Faded military posters hung beside family photos. The faint sound of an old radio buzzed through a cracked speaker. There were no suits, no sales pitches, just the sound of work and truth. And in the center of the bay, beneath a blue tarp, sat a dusty, forgotten body of a car. Long, solid, black paint chipped from time. "That's her," Sam said. 1964 Lincoln Continental. Came in 6 years ago. Owner never finished paying for the framework. Been sitting ever since." Jasmine stepped forward, ran her hands slowly along the dusty fender. "She's still got something left," she said. Sam nodded. "She's got everything left," he replied. "She just needs someone who sees it." Jasmine turned to the students. "This," she said softly, "is what real respect looks like. Not because it's fancy, not because it's expensive, but because it's built by hands that care." She looked back at Sam. "How long to bring her back to life?" He scratched his beard, stepped around the hood, inspecting it like a surgeon assessing an old injury. 3 months, 4 if we do it right. Won't be cheap, won't be fast, but she'll be perfect." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Do it." The answer came not from money, but from conviction. Sam didn't flinch. He didn't ask to see her bank account. He didn't ask for a deposit. He just nodded again. Then I'll get started tomorrow. The kids watched all of it unfold. Not like a transaction, but like a passing of something sacred. The kind of trust that couldn't be bought, only earned. And Jasmine was standing in a garage filled with dust and grease and grief, felt something she hadn't felt in that luxury showroom. Seen, equal, whole. Before they left, Sam walked Jasmine to the edge of the lot, away from the kids, his voice quieter now. I lost my boy in 2008, he said. His name was Eli. He wanted to open a place like this with me. Didn't make it home. Jasmine bowed her head slightly. I'm sorry. Sam nodded, eyes misting, but steady. You know what I see when I look at that car? He asked. The same thing I saw in him. Something that shouldn't be thrown away, just because it's no longer polished. Jasmine placed a hand on his shoulder. That's why I came here, she said, because people need to see that value isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's covered in dust or doubt, but it's there. She looked back at the car. And when it's brought back to life, people remember. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the wind shifting around them, carrying the quiet weight of everything unspoken. No reporters, no hashtags, just a small act of restoration, of metal, of memory, and of something larger than either of them. And as the bus pulled away, Jasmine looked back one last time at the garage. The tarp, now lifted halfway. The Lincoln, exposed to light for the first time in years. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a promise. One being rebuilt, bolt, by hands that knew what loss was, and still chose to build anyway. The work had taken nearly 4 months. 4 months of rebuilding, resanding, rewiring, every bolt, every stitch, every curve of the car, treated like a second chance. Sam and his small team had worked around the clock, sometimes sleeping in the garage, sometimes crying when no one else could see. What started as a project had become something personal. Each time Sam touched the steering wheel, he thought of Eli. Each time he wiped the chrome clean, he thought of Jasmine's words. By the end, the Lincoln wasn't just restored, it was reborn. The day it rolled out of the shop, black paint glistening under the Texas sun, it no longer belonged to the past. It was a message wrapped in steel. Word spread quickly. Media outlets picked up the story again, first local, then national. The car that prejudice tried to stop, one headline read. Another called it a vehicle with more soul than engine. But Jasmine didn't speak to reporters. Not yet. She was waiting for the right moment, the right setting, the right audience. And that moment came on a spring evening at a charity auction held in a converted airplane hangar just outside Dallas. The event had been organized in partnership with the newly formed Common Ground Scholarship Fund, a nonprofit Jasmine quietly launched in the weeks following the viral video. Its mission, to fund college tuition for underserved students, especially those who had been made to feel like they didn't belong in the rooms where futures are decided. The hangar was transformed that night. White lights strung from steel rafters, chairs lined in perfect rows. The Lincoln Park Center stage, like royalty. A velvet rope circled the car, but it wasn't there for protection. It was for reverence. Guests began to arrive in formal wear, business suits, cocktail dresses, but they weren't the only ones in attendance. Jasmine had made sure of that. Sitting in the front 2 rows were the same students who had walked with her through that dealership. Now they sat in ties and polished shoes, borrowed dresses and pressed collars, not to impress anyone, but to remind everyone what this night was truly about. When the bidding began, no one expected what happened next. The opening price started at $100,000. Hands went up quickly. $150,000, then $250,000, then $500,000. By the time it crossed the $1 million mark, the room had gone silent. Not because of the number, but because of what it meant. The people bidding weren't just buying a car. They were buying the right to say, I stood for something when it mattered. When the final bid came in, $1.3 million, the room erupted. Not with a flash of celebration, but with something deeper, gratitude, Purpose. Redemption. Jasmine stepped to the podium as applause faded. She wasn't wearing anything extravagant, just a black blouse and a pin with the initials CGF over her heart. The crowd hushed the moment she reached the microphone. Cameras flashed, but she didn't speak to them. She spoke to the room. Some people saw this as just a car, she began. Just metal, paint, wheels. She paused. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not for donors, but for the kids. And when she found them, she smiled. But to me, it was something else. A symbol, a mirror, a line someone tried to draw between what I was allowed to want and what they thought I deserved. And I knew then, this car had to mean more than horsepower and leather seats. It had to become something that carried our hopes forward, not just my own. There was no need for theatrics. The room was locked in, every breath held. Because sometimes, she said, a car isn't just a vehicle. It's trust. It's dignity. It's a dream waiting to be driven toward a future that doesn't ask you to prove you belong. Her words landed like a quiet thunder, the kind that echoes long after the sound fades. And tonight, that dream raised $1.3 million for kids who deserve the kind of yes too many of us had to fight for. That's not charity. That's justice. The applause didn't explode. It built, slow, deep, rising with meaning. People stood, not because it was expected, but because it felt necessary. Jasmine stepped away from the podium, walked toward the students, and knelt to meet them at eye level. "This is yours," she whispered, "and no one can take it from you." Behind her, the Lincoln shimmered under the lights. A car once used to exclude now stood as a symbol of inclusion, rebuilt, reclaimed, reborn, and ready to drive someone's dream home. But while the lights dimmed on the charity auction stage and the restored Lincoln was rolled into its new life as a symbol of change, back at the old showroom, the ground was quietly starting to crack. What Jasmine had left behind wasn't just a silence. It was a fault line. And now, the pressure was breaking it open. The video had done more than go viral. It had opened a door to stories, to patterns, to pain. And through it came a flood of voices, many who'd never been filmed, never been heard, but had lived through the same humiliation Jasmine faced that day. Men and women from every walk of life began speaking up. Their stories weren't dramatic. That was the point. They were common, which made them even more damning. Within days, local journalists began investigating. At first, the dealership released a generic statement about retraining and recommitting to inclusion. But it was already too late. The public didn't want promises. They wanted answers. And what followed was a slow, unstoppable unraveling. Former employees came forward, 3 anonymously, 1 on record. Each told the same story: a toxic culture where appearance decided priority, where sales training included unwritten rules about who to approach and who to ignore. One former salesman described being quietly warned not to waste time on walk-ins who don't look like they're here to buy. Another recalled seeing Bradley shut down an older black couple with a single glance. "They don't have the right energy," he'd said. That phrase, the right energy, kept coming up in testimony after testimony. It had no clear definition. That was the point. It gave management plausible deniability, while giving staff permission to discriminate. Race wasn't mentioned directly. Neither was class. But both were baked into every decision, every sidestep, every cold shoulder dressed in polite words. Customers came forward with receipts, emails, voicemails, text messages that hinted, dismissed, or outright refused appointments once staff saw their LinkedIn photos or heard the wrong zip code. And slowly, painfully, a picture emerged. What happened to Jasmine wasn't shocking. It was standard. The dealership's name became national shorthand for performative luxury. Headlines sharpened, "Behind the Glass: What Really Happens at Crestview Luxury Autos." More than a moment, a pattern of silence and prejudice. A well-known civil rights group launched a formal complaint with the state consumer board. An internal investigation began, and within weeks, the dealership's brand partners began distancing themselves. A luxury automaker pulled out of an exclusive event. A financial institution froze their promotional campaign with the dealership. It wasn't just PR damage anymore. It was structural collapse. And at the heart of the storm, Bradley, the man whose smirk once filled the showroom, now disappeared into it. First, he stopped showing up in public. Then he stopped taking internal meetings. Staff reported seeing him only once after the video went viral, pacing in his office, red-faced, shouting into his phone. Then one day without announcement, his nameplate was gone, just like that. Official word came through a line buried in a company memo. Effective immediately, Bradley Hart will no longer serve as general manager of Crestview. There was no farewell, no accountability, no apology. When a local reporter tracked him down outside a gated community 2 towns over, she asked one simple question. "Do you regret what happened?" Bradley stared at her for a long second. Then he turned away, opened his car door, and muttered, "I have nothing to say." It was the last time anyone saw him in public. Back at the dealership, the staff tried to recover. But the air had changed. Walk-ins slowed to a trickle. Former customers canceled appointments, citing ethical reasons in email after email. One longtime client posted a public letter. "I don't want to spend my money where people are evaluated before they even speak." Inside the building, tension tightened. Every interaction felt like it was being watched. Salespeople whispered about hidden cameras, about surprise audits, about when they should start looking for other jobs. A few tried to stay optimistic, but most knew the truth. You can't sell trust once you've proven you don't know how to give it. And while the management scrambled to repaint their image, Jasmine stayed silent. She gave no comment on the firing, no reaction to the headlines, because she knew the lesson was already written, not by her, but by the world watching. The injustice had been quiet, but the response was not. The moment Bradley laid a hand on her, he didn't just cross a line. He revealed how many people had been pushed out of places like that long before her. How many had walked away quietly, alone, unseen. Jasmine's story wasn't about one car, one man, one dealership. It was about how we build spaces and who we allow to stand in them. Now the doors of Crestview were still open, but fewer walked through them, and every empty seat was a reminder. Respect isn't a luxury, it's the cost of doing business. The cracks in Crestview's marble floor had barely settled before something deeper began to stir across the country. The viral video may have started with one woman in a dealership, but its resonance echoed far beyond Dallas. Across towns, cities, suburbs, Americans began looking inward and speaking up. The quiet wrongs, the subtle humiliations, the sharp, wordless rejections. It was all flooding to the surface, on social media, on podcasts, in barbershops and diners. People began to say what they had carried alone for years. "I know that look. I've felt that pause. I've lived that silence." At first, it was small. A woman in Atlanta shared how she was once followed around a luxury department store because she wore a hoodie after work. A nurse in Chicago described being told to use the service entrance while trying to cash a check on her lunch break. A farmer in Idaho remembered how a banker looked at his calloused hands before saying, "We don't do small loans here." These stories weren't loud. They were quiet, and that was what made them powerful. The same pattern, the same look of doubt, the same assumptions, made not from truth, but from appearance. But the flood didn't stop there. Then came the men who had grown up taught to stay silent, men who had worked hard, served their country, raised families, and still, in small corners of their lives, were made to feel less than. They were construction foremen who'd been ignored in high-end restaurants, veterans who were questioned while shopping for a suit, retired factory workers who had walked into a bank and been offered pamphlets instead of help. They hadn't spoken then, but they were speaking now. A 68-year-old former Marine from Ohio wrote, "I was in uniform when I came home from Vietnam. I still remember the bank manager who told me to come back with someone more appropriate." I never told anyone. I didn't want to seem bitter. I thought I had to just take it. But seeing Jasmine stand there and say no without yelling, I realized something. We should have said something a long time ago. Another story came from a retired postal worker in New Jersey. I was wearing work boots when I went to test drive a Cadillac in 1989. The salesman told me, "Let me show you the used section instead." I paid cash somewhere else that week. I never forgot the way that felt. Now, I want to say it out loud. It was a reckoning, but not just about race. It was about class, dignity, tone, presence. It was about how America still used surface judgments to sort its people. Who gets a welcome? Who gets a warning? Who gets the smile? And who gets the clipboard? Jasmine watched it all unfold with the kind of steady resolve only hard-lived experience can build. She didn't try to control the wave. She let it rise. And then she gave it direction. 2 weeks after the Lincoln auction, she stood at a podium again, this time in front of small business owners, service workers, educators, and veterans. No lights, no velvet ropes, just truth in the room. She called the campaign Silent Bias, Loud Voices. The mission was simple, but sharp, to hold companies accountable not just for what their policies say, but for what their employees do when no one's watching. It wasn't about catching people being bad. It was about retraining what respect means when no one's earned it yet. Jasmine looked out across the crowd and said, "Too often we're taught that silence is strength, that if someone judges you, you prove them wrong by rising above it. But what if we didn't have to prove anything? Just to be treated like people?" This isn't about lawsuits, it's about culture, about retraining the muscle memory of our nation's service industries to greet everyone with equal dignity. No exceptions. Not because they might spend money, but because they walked through the door. The room stood still, not from shock, from agreement. This was the conversation they'd been waiting for. From corner stores in Mississippi to diners in Montana, people began printing the Silent Bias Pledge and taping it in their windows. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't corporate, but it said everything. We don't judge by clothes, we don't judge by voice, we judge by nothing at all. You walk in, you're seen, you're served. The campaign gained momentum in unexpected places. A chain of mechanic shops in Detroit held training sessions. A family-owned furniture store in Virginia made the pledge part of its hiring process. A small-town bakery in Kansas offered discounts to customers who shared their bias stories in the community notebook by the register. On TikTok, a trucker from Missouri told his 700,000 followers about a time he'd been denied service for wearing overalls. "That ain't happening here," he said, pointing to the sticker on his rig. Number, silent, bias, loud voices. But the most surprising shift came from a place few expected. Old men who had once believed silence was survival. They began appearing on local radio, in letters to the editor, in slow, gravelly-voiced interviews. Not shouting, not demanding, just telling the truth. "I kept quiet for 30 years, one man said on a podcast. But if she could stand there in that showroom and not move, then I can sit here and say my piece." One clip from a small-town news segment went viral. An 82-year-old farmer in suspenders and a flannel shirt telling a local anchor, "I was made to feel small in a bank lobby in 1973. I didn't tell my wife, I didn't tell my sons, but I'm telling you now. That wasn't right, and it still ain't." It wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a movement, not led by shouting, not fueled by anger, but carried by the quiet, relentless voices of people who had had enough of being measured before being met. Jasmine didn't speak at every event. She didn't need to. What she'd done had already spoken loud enough. She simply stood at the edge of a moment and let it rise, not with fire, but with focus. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with noise. Sometimes it comes with someone standing still and refusing to be pushed out of the room. The world had kept moving. The silent bias campaign had taken root in small towns and big cities alike. Letters kept pouring in. More businesses signed the pledge. Jasmine stayed visible, but focused. Her message remained clear. This was not about outrage. This was about correction, quiet correction. Her days were filled with meetings, school visits, late-night calls about funding and outreach. But nothing she had done, not the auction, not the speech, not even the movement, prepared her for the call she received one rainy Tuesday afternoon. Her assistant handed her the phone, her expression unreadable. "It's someone claiming to be Bradley's father," she said softly. "He didn't leave a last name, just asked if you'd hear him out." Jasmine hesitated for half a second, then took the phone. She didn't know what to expect. A defense? A plea? A veiled threat? What she got was none of those things. What she got was a voice, old, worn, layered in the kind of sorrow that didn't come from headlines, but from something deeper. "Congresswoman Crockett," the man began, his tone steady but heavy. "My name is Thomas Hart. I'm Bradley's father. I'm 72 years old. I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I've watched this country rise and fall, and try again." There was a long pause, then quieter. "I taught my son about service, about discipline, about honor. But somewhere along the way, I must have taught too little or too softly, because what he did to you wasn't just wrong. It was a failure of everything I tried to build in him." Jasmine stayed silent, letting him speak. The line between them felt fragile, like holding breath. "I'm not calling to make excuses," he said. "I'm calling because I needed you to hear this from someone who still remembers what respect means. You didn't yell. You didn't strike. You didn't humiliate him. But you broke him, not out of vengeance, out of truth. You held up a mirror, and he saw what he had become, and so did I." There was a tremor in his voice now. Not weakness, but weight. "I used to tell him that a good soldier doesn't judge who he stands beside. He just stands for all of them. Maybe I should have said it louder. Maybe I should have lived it more myself. But what I couldn't teach him, you did. You taught him through grace and silence and patience. You taught him the hard way, but you did it." Jasmine felt something shift in her chest. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, just something human, something real. "I can't undo what he did," Thomas said, "but I can thank you. And I can ask, if you have the strength left to stand before more men like me, men who are trying to unlearn their silence, men who need to hear the story from someone who didn't fight back, but still won." Another pause. "I'd like to invite you to speak at the National Veterans Congress this fall," he said, "not as a politician, not even as a guest, but as someone who reminded an old soldier what dignity still looks like, even when it's under fire." The call ended not with fanfare, but with a quiet thank you and a silence. That meant something had shifted. When fall arrived, Jasmine stood backstage in a vast convention center in Washington, D.C. The room beyond the curtain buzzed not with media frenzy, but with the low murmur of men and women who had worn the weight of uniform, of duty, of scars. Over 3,000 veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, not to debate war or politics, but to hear from someone who had never picked up a weapon, but had held her ground like it was won. She wore no medals, no political pins, just a dark suit, a notebook, and the same calm strength that had become her signature. When her name was called, the applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. And when she stepped to the podium, the room went still. She looked out, not into a sea of strangers, but into a field of stories. Eyes that had seen more than most could carry. Men and women who knew what it meant to be judged before speaking, or worse, to stay silent out of fear of being misunderstood. Jasmine began softly, but with steel behind every word. "I never served in uniform," she said, "but I've stood in rooms where I was treated like a threat for simply being present. I've walked into spaces where my silence made people nervous, where my calm was mistaken for ignorance, where my posture was seen as defiance." She paused, scanned the faces, then continued. "But I never raised my voice, because I was raised by people who taught me that real strength isn't how loud you get. It's how still you stay when someone tries to push you out." There were no cameras broadcasting this speech, no viral clips waiting to explode. But Jasmine didn't need the internet to hear her. She had the room. And in that room were men who had fought in foreign jungles, lost friends in sandstorms, and returned home to be treated like burdens instead of heroes. You understand what it's like to be misjudged, she said, to walk into a room and be told, quietly or otherwise, that you don't belong, that you're too damaged, too worn, too loud, too quiet, too something. But what you taught this country, what you taught me, is that character isn't decided by appearance. It's revealed under pressure, it's proven in restraint, and it's remembered by how you made people feel when they were most invisible. When she finished, she stepped back from the mic. No music played, no screen lit up, but slowly, the room stood, not with the urgency of applause, but with the gravity of respect. One by one, old boots, worn knees, raised chins, quiet dignity. Among them, in the third row from the front, was a 72-year-old man with silver hair and a Marine Corps pin on his lapel. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. He just placed a hand over his heart and nodded once. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come with cheers. Sometimes it comes with silence. And a single honest gesture from a man who finally understood what it means to stand at attention. Not for rank, but for principle. As the last veteran lowered himself slowly back into his chair, and the standing ovation faded into silence, Jasmine remained still. Not frozen, but grounded. The lights above her were dim, the stage bare, the air in the room thick with a kind of reverence that words couldn't quite touch. She had said what needed saying, but something in her chest told her, it's not finished yet. There was one more truth to speak, one more line that hadn't been drawn in chalk or shouted through microphones, but carried quietly inside her. Through every moment of injustice, every silent dismissal, every time she was told, without words, that she didn't belong. She stepped forward again. No notes, no teleprompter, no applause cue. Her voice, though quiet, returned with more weight than before. There's one thing I want to leave you with, she said, eyes scanning the room again. Something that's been with me since the moment I was judged in that dealership. Not for my character, not for my purpose, but for the cut of my jacket and the color of my skin. She didn't blink. She didn't look down. The way we treat people who are not like us, she said slowly, letting each word land, is the way the world will treat us in return. The silence in the room was deeper now, not empty, but charged. If we teach our children to fear difference, they will grow up afraid of themselves. If we teach our workers to scan for signs of status before offering basic kindness, then we turn our businesses into battlegrounds. And if we allow judgment to wear a smile and call itself policy, then we lose more than dignity. We lose direction. She paused, not for effect, but to breathe through it. No one is too young to deserve respect. And no one, she said, voice rising just slightly, is too old to relearn how to give it. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some nodded. Others closed their eyes. A few wiped tears they hadn't expected. And near the back of the room, an older woman in a wheelchair whispered to the man beside her, "That's it. That's the truth we forget." Jasmine continued, voice unwavering. We all grew up in systems that trained us to look for difference first: race, accent, clothing, posture, zip code. And we were taught that those things told us who someone was. But they don't. They never did. What tells you who someone is how they carry themselves under pressure, how they treat the person with the least to offer them. She stepped back now, not because she was done, but because she had given the room back to itself. The message was no longer hers. It had been handed off, from her heart to theirs, from one room to a nation. Because what Jasmine had just said wasn't only a reflection, it was a warning and a map. Outside the convention hall that evening, the air was cooler than expected. The sun was slipping below the horizon, dragging with it a soft orange glow that pooled across the concrete like spilled gold. Jasmine stood alone for a moment beside a flagpole, her hands folded in front of her. The rush of the day had passed. The weight of the speech had settled. What remained was a strange stillness. Not peace exactly, but clarity. The kind that doesn't come from winning. The kind that comes from enduring and still choosing grace. A man approached slowly from behind. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. "I served 32 years, he said, his voice low, gravelly. "Thought I'd seen it all. Desert, politics, loss. But today, you reminded me I've still got some learning left to do." She turned to face him. He looked maybe 75. Wrinkled hands, military pin on his lapel. No press badge, no fanfare. Just truth in his eyes. "I taught my kids to work hard, keep their heads down, not cause trouble. But now I wonder if I should have taught them how to stand still instead. How to look someone in the eye and say, 'You don't get to decide who I am.'" He let out a quiet breath. "You said it without ever saying it. That takes more strength than most men I've known." Jasmine nodded once gently. "Respect isn't loud," she said, "but it's unforgettable." They stood in silence a little longer. 2 generations, 2 different wars, same truth. Over the next few weeks, that line, "No one is too old to relearn respect," began surfacing in places no one expected. It was quoted on news segments, printed on T-shirts, painted on murals across school gymnasiums and courthouse walls. A sheriff in North Carolina posted it above the station entryway. A librarian in Montana printed it on every receipt. A barber shop in Detroit carved it into the side of their mirror. It became more than a quote. It became a challenge, a mirror, and a new kind of pledge. Because somewhere, beneath the noise of trending hashtags and media cycles, something else was rising. A hunger for decency that didn't ask for permission. A quiet uprising of values that didn't need a microphone. Only a backbone. Jasmine never asked to become the symbol of that shift, but she became the voice that helped carry it forward, not by shouting louder than the injustice, but by never lowering herself to its level. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Jasmine Crockett, a Black attorney, was asked to leave her first-class seat, even though she paid for it in full. The reason? She wasn't a familiar face in the VIP cabin. Within just 5 minutes, what seemed like a small act ignited a storm that would shake the entire airline industry. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't resist. But she carried something far more powerful than outrage. Power. How did one quiet passenger force an entire system to confront the truth it had buried for decades? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the vaulted ceilings of Washington Dulles, Gate C-17 buzzed with quiet urgency. This wasn't just any flight. It was Skylux 801 to London, the route of diplomats, executives, and power brokers. Jasmine Crockett stepped aboard without fanfare. No entourage, no designer labels, just a sleek black blazer, slacks, low heels, and the kind of presence that filled a room even in silence. Her glasses caught the cabin lights as she moved toward seat 1A, premium workspace, extra legroom, perfect privacy. She carried a slim laptop, a leather folio labeled EU Ethics Draft, and the weight of billion-dollar decisions. No one gave her a second look. To them, she was just another quiet passenger. But Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary traveler. She was a renowned civil rights attorney and the CEO of Equinet, an AI ethics firm valued at $2.9 billion. She chose to blend in. The world, as she knew too well, didn't hand respect to women like her. But just as Jasmine powered on her laptop and opened her files, the atmosphere shifted. A tall blonde flight attendant appeared beside her row, posture impeccable, lips curled into a tight, polished smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile at all. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, tone drenched in artificial sweetness. I believe there's been a seating mistake. She gestured subtly toward the front, her voice lowering, but her condescension sharpening like a blade. This seat, 1A, is typically reserved for our longtime elite guest, Mrs. Whitfield. She's one of our most loyal flyers. I'm sure you understand. Jasmine blinked slowly, trying to process the implication buried beneath the polite phrasing. The message was crystal clear. You may have the ticket, but you don't fit the profile. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about presence. And Jasmine, a black woman in a space rarely afforded to women like her, was being told, without the words ever needing to be spoken, that her presence itself was the error. Before Jasmine could respond, the air shifted again, this time colder. The click of designer heels announced the arrival of Karen Whitfield, a statuesque woman in her late 50s with ice blonde hair, draped in a snow-white trench coat and oversized pearl earrings that screamed old money. She didn't address Jasmine directly. Instead, she looked past her, toward the flight attendant, with a smile of entitlement so casual it bordered on cruelty. I always sit there, she said, loud enough for at least 3 rows to hear. This is my seat. Everyone knows that. Then finally she turned to Jasmine, eyes scanning her from head to toe like an unexpected stain on fine linen. You must be new to this route, she added with a thin smile, voice silky with disdain. You don't look like you fly this often, or belong up here at all. Every word hit like a slap dressed in velvet. The cabin held its breath. And for a moment, the fight wasn't over a seat. It was over place, power, and the right to exist without apology. The cabin was silent but charged, like the pause between thunder and lightning. Karen's words still lingered in the air, a venom-laced whisper dressed as casual entitlement. Jasmine didn't rush. She moved with the kind of deliberate control that only came from years of fighting to be heard in rooms designed to keep her silent. Without saying a word, she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and drew out a Titan membership card. Metal, jet black, with beveled edges and the Skylux logo gleaming like a blade. It wasn't just a loyalty card, it was proof of elite status, earned by those in the top 0.1% of global flyers. Alongside it, she placed her first-class boarding pass on the tray table, edges perfectly aligned, like evidence submitted in court. The gold foil print caught the light. Seat 1A, Jasmine Crockett. Her voice when it came was calm but firm, precise like a closing argument. This is my seat, booked in advance, paid at full fare, confirmed under my name. And this, she tapped the card gently, is my Titan membership. I've flown more miles with this airline than most people log in a lifetime. The flight attendant glanced down, her smile faltering as the reality of Jasmine's credentials crashed into her assumptions. But the hesitation in her eyes revealed a deeper truth. She was still looking for a way around it, as if the facts weren't enough, as if the system still had a say in who was allowed to belong. Jasmine knew that look. She had seen it in courtrooms, boardrooms, and now, at 38, with $1 billion company behind her, on a plane she helped finance through her business partnerships. She was done justifying her presence, and yet here she was again, forced to prove what should have been unquestionable. The cabin buzzed with a low, uneasy energy. Jasmine had made her position clear. Documents on the tray table, status undeniable, but clarity didn't always guarantee justice. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, eyes darting between Jasmine's Titan card and Karen's expectant stare. And then, with the subtlety of someone who'd done it before, Karen leaned in, lowering her sunglasses just enough to meet the attendant's eyes. Her lips barely moved. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice silk on steel, "for handling this delicate matter." She slid her hand into the side pocket of her cream-colored coat, then reached out, not toward Jasmine, but toward the pocket of the attendant's blazer. What passed between them wasn't a handshake, it was an exchange. A quick, seamless motion, a tight fold of bills, clean, deliberate, disappearing into navy polyester. It was over in seconds. No receipt, no acknowledgement. Just the silent transaction of privilege rewarding obedience. The attendant gave the faintest nod, eyes flicking to the money for only a fraction of a second, before smoothing her jacket like nothing had happened. Her smile returned, this time thinner, tighter, more mechanical. She turned slightly toward the front of the cabin, as if moving to check on something. But her pace slowed, a hesitation or perhaps guilt. But it didn't matter. The bribe had done its job, reaffirmed Karen's dominance, undermined Jasmine's truth, and tilted the balance in favor of injustice. What neither of them realized was that row 3, seat D, had a front row view. A young man, early 30s, traveling solo, had instinctively raised his phone minutes earlier when voices began to rise in first class. At first, he thought he was witnessing a simple seating dispute, but the tension, the tone, the carefully masked hostility, it pulled at something deeper. So he kept recording. And now through his lens, he captured it all. Karen's smooth sleight of hand, the whisper, the cash, the complicity. The lighting wasn't perfect, but the frame was steady, the audio shockingly clear. He didn't say a word, didn't shift in his seat. He just watched, documenting the exact moment when a bribe tried to bury the truth. He knew what this was. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was an orchestrated removal, bought and paid for. And thanks to him, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. But corruption never works alone. It always calls for backup. The flight attendant, her confidence visibly cracking after pocketing Karen's bribe, turned abruptly and vanished behind the first-class curtain. Less than a minute later, she reappeared with Trevor, the cabin's supervisor, walking beside her with practiced authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the kind of self-assured smirk that came not from training, but from years of getting his way, Trevor carried himself like a man used to winning arguments without raising his voice. His eyes scanned the cabin, zeroing in on Jasmine with clinical detachment, as if she were a delay, not a human being. He stopped at her seat, squared his stance, and crossed his arms, every movement choreographed for dominance, not diplomacy. "Ma'am," he said, tone clipped and sharp, "I've been informed there's a seating issue here." He didn't ask what happened. He didn't request her side. He'd already decided who was out of place, and all that was left was getting her out. Jasmine looked up, her expression still composed, but something in her jaw tightened, a tiny shift that betrayed how familiar this was. She was no longer speaking to an airline crew. She was now facing a tribunal dressed in navy and gold. Trevor leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice just enough to signal control, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We'd like to resolve this quickly and quietly. Would you mind cooperating and moving to another seat? It'll just be easier that way." "Easier for who?" The question stayed behind Jasmine's eyes, unspoken but thundering. Around her, the cabin had turned into a courtroom where no one waited for facts. They only looked for confirmation of their bias. A woman clutched her designer purse closer. A man in business class leaned sideways, pretending to adjust his tie while angling his phone toward the scene. Every breath Jasmine took felt heavier. She could feel the weight of judgment settling onto her, like turbulence without warning. Not one person stood up. Not one person said, "She's right." In that moment, it wasn't just the crew surrounding her. It was the silence of every person who'd rather avoid discomfort than confront injustice. The pressure was surgical, unrelenting, and intentionally public. Trevor stepped back slightly, glanced at the attendant, then looked to Karen, who stood just a few feet away, watching like a queen awaiting her throne. Her arms were folded, her face smug, her posture screamed of satisfaction, because everything was going exactly how she'd planned. Jasmine was boxed in, not by metal walls, but by a system engineered to erode her dignity without ever raising a voice. She had the boarding pass, she had the highest tier membership, but none of it mattered. In this cabin, her qualifications had become invisible the moment she sat down. All that remained was the expectation: know your place and move. The tension in the cabin had shifted from subtle discomfort to something far more volatile, controlled but electric, like the final second before lightning strikes. Trevor stood over Jasmine with the practiced authority of someone used to obedience, his arms folded tightly across his chest, jaw clenched. Behind him, the flight attendant avoided Jasmine's gaze, her earlier confidence crumbling into rigid discomfort. Karen remained planted just feet away, arms crossed, her expression a portrait of smug entitlement, as if the mere passage of time without Jasmine moving was a personal offense. Passengers around them kept glancing, then quickly looking away, their silence loud, their complicity louder. This was no longer a dispute about a seat. This was a test of who the rules actually applied to and who they didn't. All eyes waited for Jasmine to fold, to rise, to retreat. Instead, she exhaled slowly, deliberately. Her every movement was calm but surgical, the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from mastery of restraint. She placed her pen down beside her boarding pass, straightened her back, and looked up at Trevor with a gaze that didn't ask for understanding. It demanded recognition. Her voice, when it broke the thick air, was quiet but resonant, every syllable carried with the full weight of a woman who had fought too many battles to be cornered by this one. "I'm not moving," she said. "This seat is mine, booked under my name, assigned by your airline, paid at full fare." She paused, not to catch her breath, but to let the words settle like gavel strikes. Then just as steadily she added, "I am a licensed civil rights attorney. I know the law, and I know my rights." Trevor's posture faltered. For the first time he blinked, not out of fatigue, but confusion. This wasn't how these scenes usually played out. He was used to bluster or fear, to loud objections or quiet surrender. Not this. Not a woman sitting in perfect silence, perfectly within her rights, perfectly unwilling to be erased. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between orders and a reality that no longer fit the script. Karen let out an audible scoff, but it barely registered. Jasmine wasn't speaking to them anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces they'd earned. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't theirs to control. Jasmine owned it, held it, transformed it into a shield. Because sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't rage. Sometimes it's simply saying, "No, I will not move." Trevor's jaw clenched tighter as Jasmine remained unmoved, her spine straight, her voice calm, her presence unshaken. His tone shifted, no longer wrapped in the forced politeness of customer service, but sharpened by frustration and threatened authority. "Ma'am," he repeated louder now, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the cabin. "I'm instructing you for the last time. Either move voluntarily, or I'll be forced to call airport security to escort you off this flight." The volume of his voice wasn't meant for Jasmine. It was meant for the audience. It was a performance, and the message was clear. Look how difficult she's being. A woman refusing to yield was now being framed as a danger. Phones slowly tilted upward, fingers hovering over record buttons. No one moved to help her, but everyone was suddenly ready to watch. Jasmine didn't even blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't back down. She simply looked at him and replied with ice-edged precision, "Go ahead. I'll wait." The words had barely settled when the cockpit door opened with a mechanical click, and Captain Mason emerged. Tall, composed, a uniform pressed so perfectly it looked vacuum-sealed. His face was unreadable, carved from decades of authority, but his eyes betrayed something colder, an eagerness to resolve the situation swiftly, regardless of who was right. He strode down the aisle with the quiet command of someone used to being obeyed before he even spoke. Without addressing Jasmine directly, he turned to Trevor and asked, "Is this the passenger?" Trevor nodded once. The captain turned toward her, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression flat. "Ma'am," he began, his voice deep and deliberate, "I've been informed that you are refusing to comply with crew instructions. At this point, your actions are interfering with the boarding process and creating a disturbance for other passengers." Jasmine's eyebrows lifted, the first visible sign of incredulity. "I'm sitting in the seat your airline assigned me," she said, measured and unshaken. "There is no disturbance except the one being caused around me." The captain's eyes hardened. "Disruption doesn't require shouting, ma'am," he replied coldly. "It only requires refusal to follow lawful direction from airline personnel." The hypocrisy landed like a slap. She was being labeled a threat not because she had broken a rule, but because she had refused to break under pressure. It didn't matter that she was calm. It didn't matter that she had proof. It didn't even matter that she was right. She had said no, And in this system, that alone was enough to justify her removal. Behind the captain, Karen stood smirking, arms folded like a queen watching a servant being dragged away. The flight attendant's face was pale now, but she said nothing. Not a word. The circle had closed. The stage was set. The truth no longer mattered, only control did. And Jasmine Crockett, for all her poise, her credentials, and her right to that seat, had just been officially marked as non-compliant. The call to remove her had been made, and with chilling precision, the system moved into place. Moments later, the unmistakable rhythm of boots echoed down the jet bridge. Two security officers in dark uniforms stepped into the cabin, eyes locked forward, postures rigid. The passengers parted instinctively, the way crowds do when authority enters a room, not out of respect, but submission. One officer paused at Jasmine's row, expression unreadable, voice flat. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to escort you off this aircraft." That was it. No mention of why. No acknowledgement of her boarding pass, Titan status, or the blatant injustice that had unfolded. Just a command, carried out without question. Jasmine didn't resist. She didn't argue. Instead, she slowly stood, her every movement precise, controlled, the grace of a woman refusing to let them steal more than they already had. She gathered her documents, closed her laptop, adjusted her blazer, and then, with her head held high, she stepped into the aisle. The walk down that narrow corridor was a gauntlet of quiet judgment. Passengers who had once ignored her now looked up, eyes wide with curiosity or contempt. Some filmed discreetly from behind menus or jackets. Others simply watched, smug in their silence. A man in a tailored suit muttered to no one in particular, "She should have just complied." Another leaned toward his wife and whispered, always looking for a reason to make a scene. Jasmine heard it all, but she didn't break stride. Each step was a statement. "You can take my seat. You will not take my self-respect." As she passed seat 1A, Karen was already reclined, a flute of champagne in hand, her satisfaction barely concealed. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Karen smirked. Jasmine didn't give her the dignity of a response. She walked past her with the elegance of someone whose value was never determined by proximity to privilege, but by the truth she carried in her bones. Once off the plane, the officers led her a few feet into the terminal and abruptly stopped. One glance at the tablet in his hand, hesitated. "We were told to escort you," he said, suddenly less sure of himself. "But there's nothing here that says you violated any policy." Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth had never been the issue. The problem wasn't what she had done. It was who she was. As the officers awkwardly stepped away, leaving her standing alone near Gate 47, another sound broke through the chaos. Hurried footsteps. A woman, mid-40s, red hair tied back, wearing jeans and a press badge on her backpack, approached with cautious urgency. "Ms. Crockett?" she asked, slightly breathless. Jasmine turned, instinctively guarded. "I was on that flight," the woman continued. "I'm a journalist. I saw everything. And I filmed it." She pulled out her phone and unlocked the screen, holding it out like a lifeline. "The bribe, the exchange, the crew's response. I caught it all. You need to have this." Jasmine took the phone slowly, watching the video as it played. Grainy footage, but crystal clear truth. The moment Karen slipped the folded bills into the attendant's pocket, the dismissive smirks, the words whispered with venom, her own refusal, calm and exact, followed by the arrival of security. It was all there. Not just injustice, but evidence. Not just bias, but proof. The journalist's voice softened. "You don't know me, but I couldn't sit there and let that happen. If you want to go public, I'll stand with you." For a moment, Jasmine said nothing. Then she looked up from the screen, met the woman's eyes and nodded. "Thank you," she said, voice steady, but carrying something deeper, resolve sharpened by pain. What happened on that flight wouldn't end with humiliation. It would ignite a reckoning. And now, with this footage in hand, the story was no longer in their control. It was hers. She stood still for a long moment in the center of the terminal, watching the crowd flow around her like a current. Behind her, the plane, the injustice, was gone. But it hadn't left her. Not the cold stares, not the smug silence, not the invisible weight that had tried, once again, to push her out of a space she had earned. Jasmine walked forward slowly, each step measured, controlled, past the boarding gates, past security, past the people whispering as they recognized her face. She didn't head for the exit. She turned toward the frosted glass doors marked Skylux First Class Lounge. Because power didn't retreat, it regrouped. Inside, the lounge was polished to perfection, gleaming marble floors, leather seating, the faint scent of citrus and expensive stillness. But the calm was cosmetic. Jasmine took a seat in the farthest corner, facing the runway through floor-to-ceiling glass. She placed her phone on the table and stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then, with a flick of her thumb, she called Elise Donovan, Chief Operating Officer of Equinet, and the one person who always knew what to do next. The line clicked. Jasmine didn't waste time. Her voice was low, razor-sharp, brimming with fire hidden beneath ice. "Elise," she said, each syllable like a drumbeat, "they just kicked me off a flight, publicly, first class, no rule broken, just a black woman in the wrong seat, apparently." A pause. "They picked the wrong person, prepare to move." There was silence on the other end for a heartbeat. Just one. Elise had been with Jasmine since the founding of Equinet. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't express outrage. She knew Jasmine's tone well. She only responded with 2 words. Understood. Mobilizing. Because this wasn't just personal, it was war, and Jasmine held the match. As the call ended, Jasmine opened her laptop. Notifications were already pouring in. The journalist's video had been sent to her personal inbox, encrypted and timestamped. A second file followed. Witness testimonies from 3 passengers who had seen the exchange, all offering to speak on record. She dragged the files into a secure server, hands steady, eyes burning with focus. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a corporate earthquake waiting to detonate, and Skylux Airlines was sitting directly on the fault line. What no one on that flight had realized, what the captain, the crew, and certainly not Karen Whitfield had understood, was that Equinet wasn't just a billion-dollar ethics tech firm. It was a silent force behind half the systems Skylux was planning to upgrade. For the past 8 months, Equinet had been in advanced negotiations to power Skylux's AI-driven customer support transformation, a $40 million contract that would overhaul the way the airline handled passenger experience, data security, and most ironically, bias mitigation. They were also the quiet financial muscle behind Skylux's most recent funding round, acquiring a full 30% of the airline's voting shares through a network of linked institutional investors, which meant Jasmine Crockett didn't just fly Skylux, she partially owned it. She took a breath and began typing directives to legal, media strategy, investor relations. Each message clinical, strategic, and pulsing with urgency. To legal, secure all footage. Prepare emergency injunction in case they attempt deletion or internal suppression. Initiate breach review. To PR, hold response until footage is verified. Prepare statement for controlled release. To board liaison, schedule emergency shareholder meeting, non-negotiable. Every click of the keyboard echoed louder than the security officer's command. This was no longer just a legal matter, it was a corporate reckoning, and Jasmine wasn't seeking apologies. She was preparing consequences. Outside the lounge, the terminal continued as if nothing had happened. People boarded planes. Announcements echoed. But in that high-glass corner, something irreversible had already begun. Jasmine reviewed the footage again, this time not with pain, but with precision. The money-changing hands, the passive complicity, the systemic rot wrapped in politeness. And then her own voice, calm, firm. "I know my rights." This wasn't about ego. It wasn't even just about her. It was about every quiet injustice that happened in business class, in hiring rooms, in board meetings where decisions were made before the first word was spoken. She had spent her career building technology to detect those systems. Now she would dismantle one live. Another alert came through. Elise had initiated internal mobilization. The company's crisis protocol, codename Hammerglass, was live. In 2 hours, Equinet would launch a controlled media leak to trusted outlets. In 3, their legal counsel would issue an open letter to Skylux's board demanding formal response. In 5, national news would run the footage. The countdown had begun. Jasmine reached into her bag and pulled out a pen, the same one she used to sign Equinet's first funding round 5 years ago. She tapped it twice against the side of her laptop, once for every time she had to prove she belonged. The third time would be different, because this time, the world would watch what happened when a system tried to erase a woman who built systems for a living. She leaned back in the chair, shoulders squared, jaw set. They thought they were ejecting a passenger. They had just woken a shareholder, a strategist, in a storm. And the skies above Skylux, they were about to turn black. While Jasmine orchestrated her next move from the quiet sanctum of the VIP lounge, the world outside was already catching fire. The video, just 2 minutes and 47 seconds long, had slipped from the hands of one journalist into the bloodstream of the internet like a digital wildfire. At first, it appeared on a small civil rights blog, then was picked up by a mid-tier media watchdog, but it only took one retweet from a prominent activist with 5 million followers for the fuse to fully ignite. Within an hour, the footage had exploded across platforms. Reddit threads dissected every frame, TikTok creators broke down the timeline second by second, and YouTube reaction videos began pouring in. The moment Karen handed off the money, the trembling smile of the flight attendant, Trevor's manufactured authority, Jasmine's quiet refusal, the security escort, the walk of shame they expected her to wear like defeat. It was all there, unfiltered, undeniable, and damning. And then came the hashtag, 3 words typed by a teenage law student in Detroit who captioned the clip, "She knew her rights. They knew their power." Justice for Jasmine. That phrase struck a nerve and roared across the digital landscape with ferocity. In just 4 hours, it had appeared in over 3.2 million tweets. Celebrities reposted it with captions like, "Unacceptable." Civil rights lawyers offered pro bono support without being asked. Airline passengers across the globe began sharing their own stories of quiet discrimination in first class, many of them eerily similar. Hashtag momentum turned into organized fury. Skylux's official accounts tried to stay silent, but silence was gasoline on the blaze. Within 6 hours, Justice for Jasmine was trending #1 worldwide on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The injustice wasn't hidden in corporate silence anymore. It was being screamed across continents. News anchors broke into regular programming to run the footage. Primetime segments debated it. Podcasts began recording emergency episodes. Public figures, from tech CEOs to U.S. senators, issued statements of support. And yet, amid the media frenzy, the most devastating commentary didn't come from politicians or influencers. It came from the comments sections, where ordinary people wrote with razor precision, "I've seen this happen to my father. My mom was told she didn't look like she belonged in business class too. They didn't just pick the wrong person. They picked the wrong generation to try this with." The story had become more than Jasmine's. It had become everyone's story. And now the world wasn't just watching. It was waiting for a reckoning. While the world outside burned with outrage and the hashtag number, Justice for Jasmine, carved its place in digital history, inside the mirrored walls of Skylux headquarters in Manhattan, chaos was setting in. The comms team was first to ring the alarm, phones ringing nonstop, inboxes flooding with media inquiries, and posts multiplying across every social media platform like an avalanche they couldn't outrun. Internally, Slack threads ignited with frantic pings. "Have you seen this video? Who was the passenger? Did someone actually take a bribe on camera?" But by the time the commotion reached the executive floor, it was too late to contain. Screens in the boardroom now glowed with footage of a woman, calm, composed, being removed from her assigned seat by force while another passenger smirked, untouched, sipping champagne. The room was silent, except for the sound of their brand, once synonymous with exclusivity and elegance, becoming a symbol of elitist rot and racial bias in real time. CEO Richard Halston, usually unshakable in the face of earnings reports and merger talks, sat motionless at the head of the table, eyes locked on the paused frame of Jasmine Crockett being escorted down the aisle. His skin had turned ghostly pale, and his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if he were chewing glass. "Someone tell me this isn't who I think it is," he finally muttered, though the answer was already clawing its way to the surface of his mind. A junior analyst, face pale, hands shaking, cleared his throat and slid a tablet across the table. On the screen, a shareholder profile pulled from the company's private investment network. Name: Jasmine D. Crockett. Occupation: CEO, Equinet Technologies. Equity stake via linked trusts and institutional funds. 30.1% voting control. A long pause followed, the kind that warps time. Then Halston whispered almost to himself, "Oh my God, she owns us." The silence that followed was deafening. One executive dropped her pen. Another leaned back so hard his chair creaked. No one moved, because this wasn't just a PR nightmare anymore. This was a strategic implosion. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a high-value customer. She wasn't even just a tech mogul. She was their largest single shareholder. And more than that, she was the visionary behind the very AI ethics platform Skylux had been preparing to integrate into its customer experience systems. A $40 million contract that now hung over their heads like a guillotine. The irony was grotesque. They had forcibly removed the architect of the very protections they claimed to be building. They hadn't just embarrassed her. They had publicly humiliated their most powerful stakeholder. A hand shot up. It was Janet Liu, head of corporate legal. Her voice was clipped, trembling slightly. "We have two immediate threats. First, if she initiates a shareholder revolt, we're vulnerable to losing board control. Second, if she withdraws from the tech contract, we'll fall behind in compliance modernization by at least 18 months. Our Q3 survival projections are tied to that rollout." Her voice cracked under the weight of what she wasn't saying. We are standing on the edge of collapse. Halston rose from his chair like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "Get me her office. Now direct line. I don't care what time it is. I don't care who I have to beg." But before the assistant could move, another alert chimed from the monitor. The stock price was dropping, fast, double digits. Thousands of retail shareholders dumping shares. Institutional confidence evaporating by the second. Halston turned back to the board. "We need to control the narrative," he barked, but the desperation in his voice cracked through the bravado. "We issue a formal apology, full responsibility, fire the crew if we have to, whatever it takes." But Janet cut in sharply. "It won't be enough." She tapped her screen again and brought up the trending analytics. Justice for Jasmine had now reached 47 million impressions. 3 senators had tweeted. 5 CEOs from Fortune 100 companies had weighed in. Influencers, lawyers, celebrities, professors. "The narrative isn't ours to control anymore," she said. "It's hers." That sentence landed like a blade through the room, because it was true. Skylux no longer owned its own reputation. Jasmine did. As tension mounted, another voice, calm, deliberate, came from the back. It was Robert Chase, an older board member with 2 decades of political and corporate crisis experience. "Gentlemen," he said, slowly removing his glasses, "this isn't damage control anymore. This is an extraction. We've offended the woman who designed the very tools that could audit our every bias, detect our every flaw, and broadcast it with precision." He turned toward Halston. "You didn't eject a passenger. You ejected your future." No one dared to argue. Across the boardroom, phones buzzed in near synchrony. News alerts, investor emails, insider leaks. The collapse had begun, and it wasn't just financial. It was existential. Halston's voice dropped, hoarse and distant. "We underestimated her." Janet shook her head. "No," she said, "you never even saw her." And that, more than anything, was the truth. Jasmine Crockett had walked onto their plane not with fanfare, not with a power suit or security detail, but with silence, intelligence, and receipts. She had been ignored, dismissed, disrespected, and now she held the future of the airline in the palm of her hand. No one in the room dared say it out loud, but they all felt it. Skylux had just made the most expensive mistake in aviation history, And Jasmine, she was just getting started. The boardroom was silent when the doors opened. Everyone stood, out of protocol, not respect, as Jasmine Crockett entered, flanked by her legal counsel, media strategist, and two high-level representatives from institutional funds that held significant Skylux shares. She didn't wear fury, she wore precision. Her black tailored suit was simple but sharp, a visual contrast to the chaos she'd walked into the day before. She carried no notes. She didn't need them. The truth had already spoken for her, across headlines, social feeds, and stock markets. Her presence alone shifted the temperature in the room. Executives straightened. Board members swallowed hard. Richard Halston, the CEO, forced a nod, but his face remained tight. Jasmine sat at the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for him. No one objected, because in this moment, everyone knew who truly held the power. She didn't start with pleasantries. She didn't start with introductions. She started with facts. Cold, hard, undeniable. You forcibly removed me from a seat I paid for. You allowed a bribe to influence operational decisions. You failed to intervene when racial bias unfolded in your cabin, on your time, in your uniform. And you did it to your largest shareholder and the architect of your next generation ethics initiative. Her voice was calm, but each word cut deeper than the last. She paused, let the weight of that truth settle, then continued. I am not here to negotiate money. I am not here for an apology crafted by your legal department. She leaned forward, voice sharpening like steel drawn from a sheath. I'm here to make one thing clear. This company will change, or it will collapse. She laid out her demands like legal exhibits, one by one, deliberate and non-negotiable. First, she said, her eyes locked on Halston, the entire crew involved in the incident, including the flight attendant, cabin manager, and captain, will be terminated immediately with full public accountability. No murmurs, no protests, just shifting discomfort around the room. Second, this airline will undergo a 48-hour operational pause across all routes. Every employee, from executive to ground staff, will complete intensive training on bias, ethics, and customer dignity. Conducted by a third-party firm, monitored independently. No exceptions. A few board members exchanged alarmed glances. 2 days grounded would cost millions. Jasmine didn't blink. Cost is no longer your primary threat. Irrelevance is. Third, she said finally, her tone softening but not relenting. The $40 million contract with Equinet is suspended until internal audit systems prove your culture meets the standards you claim to uphold. Halston opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. Don't. I know the numbers. I know what the loss of that contract means. I also know it's the only leverage I'll need to ensure this isn't just another PR stunt. There was a long silence. Then slowly she stood. Her final words were not a threat. They were a verdict. I could liquidate my position, dump 30% of your shares by morning, and let the market devour you. But I'm not here to destroy you. Not yet. I want something bigger. She looked around the room, locking eyes with each person who had remained silent as her dignity was stripped at 30,000 feet. I want transformation. I want this company to mean something more than status and uniforms. I want every single person who looks like me to never fear flying with you again. And then she said it. Quiet, clear, devastating. I could pull out, but what I want is real change. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone. This was no longer a shareholder meeting. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't asking for permission. She was rewriting the rules. The fallout began less than 24 hours after Jasmine Crockett left the boardroom. As promised, she didn't wait for change. She demanded it, and Skylux, cornered by public fury and shareholder pressure, had no choice but to act. The company scheduled an all-staff broadcast typically used for quarterly updates or holiday announcements. But this was different. The title of the internal live stream read only, Accountability Session, Mandatory Attendance. Thousands of employees logged in, pilots from Frankfurt, desk agents in Atlanta, engineers in Tokyo. The screen opened with a stark black background, white text glowing in the center. This is what failure looks like. Then, without warning, the infamous flight footage began playing in full, unedited, uninterrupted, and damning. It started with the bribe. Karen's hand slipping folded bills into the flight attendant's pocket. Her voice a venom-laced whisper. "Thanks for handling this delicately." Next came Trevor, stiff with fake authority, threatening removal. Then the captain, cold and indifferent, declaring Jasmine a disruption. Finally, the silent walk of humiliation as security escorted her off the plane, with Karen sipping champagne behind her. Employees across continents watched, horrified, as the truth played out not in lawsuits or headlines, but in real time, on their own company's feed. When the video ended, the screen faded to black again. Then three names appeared: Trevor Winslow, cabin manager Jessica Mayers, senior flight attendant Captain Dennis Reynolds, flight commander. A pause, then the text, "Terminated, effective immediately." The firings were swift, public, and deliberate. There were no NDA-shielded exits, no quiet retirements, no internal reshuffling. These weren't employees making mistakes. They were faces of a system that had finally been forced to admit what it had protected for far too long. Skylux sent a second wave of emails minutes later, an internal statement from the CEO himself, confirming that all three individuals had been let go for clear violations of ethics, professional conduct, and equal treatment protocols. And though the tone was corporate, the message was unmistakable. This time, someone paid the price. But to many, especially those who had lived versions of Jasmine's story in silence, the gesture was too little, too late. The media had already seized the moment. Within hours, headlines swept across every major outlet. Skylux crew fired after ethics scandal, video played for entire company, systemic discrimination in the skies, a $50 million mistake. Jasmine Crockett forces airlines hand in live-fire corporate reckoning. CNN called it the most visible corporate ethics collapse since the Cambridge Analytica breach. Forbes dubbed it the $50 million moral implosion. The phrase caught fire. The $50 million fall. It was repeated across nightly news, podcasts, and global commentary. The public wasn't just watching, they were dissecting. Think pieces emerged. Business schools prepped case studies. HR teams across industries cited the event in memos about reform. But inside Skylux, the temperature was ice cold. Executives avoided eye contact. Senior staff spoke only in whispers. The company that once boasted luxury, prestige, and refinement was now synonymous with betrayal and systemic bias. Well-dressed injustice at 35,000 feet. Meanwhile, the financial bleeding began. On the first day following Jasmine's boardroom intervention, Skylux stock dropped 6%. Day 2, it slipped another 8%. By the end of day 3, the total decline hit 18%, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value. Hedge funds pulled positions. Retail investors fled. Analysts downgraded their projections. A Bloomberg analyst called it an identity crisis in real time, while another noted grimly, "It's not the scandal that's tanking the stock, it's the silence before it, the culture that let it happen, and the fear it might happen again." Behind closed doors, Skylux's investor relations team scrambled to explain how the airline had allowed one of its top shareholders to be publicly humiliated, and how no one had known until it was too late. The answer, of course, was painfully simple. They didn't ask who she was, because they never believed she could be who she is. In the days that followed, Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds vanished from internal systems. Their badges were revoked, their bios deleted. But in the age of the internet, silence wasn't privacy. Their names trended alongside hashtags like #DoBetter and #bias in uniform. Their faces, frozen mid-denial and screen-captured shame, became memes, cautionary tales, and digital graffiti etched into a culture exhausted by quiet complicity. One post summed it up perfectly. "You don't get to hide behind a uniform when your bias is louder than your service." And yet Jasmine never spoke to the press. Not once. She let the facts speak for themselves. She let the footage do the shouting, and she let the consequences, for the first time in corporate memory, arrive not as a payout, but as a purge. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about resetting the system. She didn't want retribution. She wanted transparency that couldn't be buried and accountability that couldn't be spun. She got both in front of the world. By the end of the week, Skylux had become a case study, not in luxury, but in legacy rot finally exposed under pressure. And as their stock tumbled, their brand fractured, and their former crew disappeared into infamy, one truth rose to the surface like oil in water. They didn't just eject the wrong passenger, they underestimated the wrong woman. And the price was everything. The shock waves didn't end with terminations or stock crashes. They were only the beginning. After the public fallout, the humiliating footage, and the internal bloodletting, Skylux made an announcement no one saw coming. In a move that stunned the entire aviation industry, the airline issued a worldwide directive. Effective immediately, all operations would be suspended for 48 hours. Flights were canceled. Terminals went quiet. Ground crews stood idle on runways from London to Dubai. The world's most exclusive airline, the one that prided itself on flawless luxury and uninterrupted service, had grounded itself for the first time in its decades-long history. The reason? Not a strike, not a technical failure, not even weather. The reason was bias, institutional, systemic, long ignored, and finally, impossible to deny. In a statement delivered by a visibly shaken CEO, Richard Halston, the words felt heavier than anything he had spoken in his career. We can no longer fly forward while carrying the weight of silence and complicity. Skylux will shut down all global operations for 48 hours while every employee, every single one, undergoes comprehensive ethics and bias reconditioning. That includes me. The press room went still. Not a single camera blinked. And for the first time, perhaps ever, a CEO of a global airline had admitted the unthinkable. This wasn't a personnel issue. It was a cultural rot. A rot that had to be assized not with PR gestures, but with radical self-surgery. Behind the scenes, the engine of change had already begun turning. Equinet, Jasmine Crockett's firm, had been formally engaged to lead the overhaul. But this wasn't some off-the-shelf corporate training program with generic slides and vague awareness goals. No, this was immersive, high-intensity, AI-driven simulation designed to replicate what Jasmine had experienced in real time. Her team of behavioral engineers, coders, and cognitive ethicists had been developing virtual reality modules for years, tools originally designed for law enforcement and hospital networks. Now, for the first time, they would be unleashed inside a corporate aviation giant. The program was called Clear Conscious Leadership, Ethics, Accountability, Rebuild. Within hours, terminals in 10 countries were converted into temporary training centers. VR headsets were flown in by the hundreds. Staff were assigned shifts like boarding schedules, except instead of working flights, they would be walking in someone else's shoes. Literally. The flagship module dropped crew members into a hyper-realistic simulation of a first-class cabin, where they themselves became the marginalized passenger, ignored, dismissed, asked to move despite having credentials, stared at, judged, and ultimately removed. Every micro-expression from simulated attendants, every dismissive glance from passengers, every decision point was recorded, analyzed, and replayed. No one could escape the discomfort, and that was the point. But the most powerful moment wasn't in the headset, it was in the room, because sitting among the attendants, janitors, baggage handlers, and junior staff was the CEO. Richard Halston, stripped of title, tie loosened, headset on, undergoing the exact same training. No private room, no shortcut. He waited in line, answered questions, absorbed the glances. Next to him sat his CFO, 3 rows back, his head of operations. And for once, they weren't at the front of the plane. They were in the back of the system, where real people had been quietly crushed for years. Some employees cried during the training. Others walked out of the room in the stunned silence. A few were furious, rattled not just by the realism, but by the mirror it held up. One security officer, after removing his headset, stared at the floor for 5 full minutes before whispering, "I thought I was fair. I didn't know what it felt like to be invisible. For some, it was the first time they had felt what Jasmine felt that day. For others, it was the first time they'd acknowledged it had ever happened at all. Each session ended not with applause, but with reflection. A digital wall filled with anonymous testimonies where employees could type one sentence about what they had learned. The screen flickered with brutal truths. I see how I looked at people differently based on their clothes. I ignored complaints like this. I thought they were overreacting. Now I understand why silence can be as violent as action. Over the course of 48 hours, Skylux grounded 2,100 flights, delayed over 350,000 passengers, and lost millions in revenue. But something else happened too. Something more valuable than quarterly profits or investor confidence. They woke up. Not all of them. Not completely. Not perfectly. But the veil had been torn. At the close of the final training day, a live stream session was broadcast company-wide. On screen, Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't there to gloat. She wasn't there to scold. She simply said, "You grounded your fleet. Now ground your assumptions. Start over. That's how we fly forward." She paused, then added, "This is not the end of a scandal. It's the beginning of a culture." Silence followed. And then, one by one, across terminals and offices worldwide, staff began to stand. Some clapped. Some just stood in respect. But they all understood something had shifted forever. Because in 48 hours, Skylux didn't just halt its planes, it confronted its soul. And for the first time in its gilded history, it finally earned the right to call itself an airline for everyone. Following the unprecedented 48-hour grounding of Skylux, after the headlines faded and the market steadied, Jasmine Crockett did something no one expected. In a world obsessed with punishment, she proposed something radical: redemption. The system had failed her, blatantly, publicly, and with devastating consequences. She could have left it burning. She had every reason to. But Jasmine knew the fight wasn't just about exposure. It was about reconstruction. True justice, in her view, didn't end with firings or viral hashtags. It began when people were forced to look inward, confront their bias, and do the hard work of becoming better. That's when she announced the launch of Project Pathway. The idea was simple but revolutionary: a structured, high-accountability re-entry program for individuals terminated due to acts of bias or discriminatory behavior within the service industry. Pathway wasn't soft. It wasn't about forgiveness without effort. It was a battlefield classroom, taught by survivors of discrimination, designed by behavioral scientists, and enforced with the same AI technology Equinet had spent years perfecting. The curriculum combined immersive bias simulations, emotional intelligence training, real-time decision modeling, and monitored public service. For every hour in the program, participants would be confronted not with shame, but with truth, unfiltered and relentless. Reintegration, Jasmine said during the launch, only means something if it's earned. Trevor Winslow, former cabin supervisor, once smug, once untouchable, applied 2 months after his termination. His name stirred immediate backlash. Journalists called it a stunt. Commenters called it performative. But Jasmine let him in, not because she believed in him, because she believed in the process. On day one, Trevor sat at the back of the Pathway intake room, arms folded, jaw locked. He sneered at the facilitators. He scoffed at the modules. He flinched during role-play simulations, where he experienced being denied service, spoken down to, or removed for no reason. But week after week, something shifted. He stopped interrupting. He started listening. In the fourth week, after reviewing a recording of himself from the day he stood over Jasmine with threats masked as procedure, he didn't speak. He just watched over and over, his own voice, his own face. It broke something open. For the first time, he said softly, "I saw her. I actually saw her." Jessica Mayers, the former flight attendant who had taken the cash, also joined the program. She entered with a quiet desperation, not to reclaim her job, but to reclaim her dignity. She cried during her first simulation when a VR passenger thanked her by name, and the system froze the moment to highlight how rare that gesture had been for people who looked like Jasmine. She wrote a journal entry that night. "I sold my values for a tip. I'll never let that happen again. Her journey wasn't linear. Some days she questioned herself. Some days she wanted to walk away. But she didn't. When she completed the program, Pathway didn't return her to the skies, but it offered her a second chance, on the ground. She was quietly reinstated as a ground support coordinator at Skylux, working directly with passengers. She didn't wear wings anymore, but she now carried the weight of them with real awareness. And then there was Captain Dennis Reynolds, once a decorated pilot with 30 years in the cockpit, now a man who had watched his legacy collapse in under 30 minutes of inaction. He didn't join the program for a second chance in aviation. He knew that part of his life was over. He joined because he couldn't live with the idea that silence had become his defining moment. He completed the program in half the time, absorbing every module, every statistic, every testimony. And when he finished, he didn't ask for reinstatement. He asked for purpose. Pathway connected him to a small aviation trade school in Colorado, where he began teaching a course titled The Ethics of Altitude, Integrity and Command. He opened his first class with a photo of Jasmine Crockett. Not as a warning, but as a standard. If you wouldn't speak up for her, he told his students, you don't belong in the sky. Jasmine never made public appearances at the Pathway graduations. She didn't need to. Her presence was in every module, every case study, every moment of confrontation and change. But at the one-year anniversary, she broke that rule. She stood in a modest auditorium in front of the first 200 graduates of the program, former managers, servers, pilots, and clerks who had all once been part of the problem. She looked out over the crowd and said, "Redemption doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with accountability. You showed up. You didn't run. You stayed when it got uncomfortable. And because of that, you've earned a new kind of uniform, the kind made of humility, not fabric." She paused, then added, "This program wasn't built for comfort. It was built for clarity, and now you have it. Use it." That night, Trevor shook her hand. He didn't ask for a photo. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "Thank you for not slamming the door shut." Jessica handed her a handwritten note. It simply read, "You made me better. I hope I make others better too." Captain Reynolds stood at the back, arms crossed, not out of defiance but respect. And when she looked his way, he nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. Because this, in the end, wasn't a story about destruction. It was a story about what comes after. Jasmine had walked through fire, and instead of letting it consume others, she turned it into a forge, where broken things could be rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and finally worthy of flight. The transformation of Skylux Airlines had been nothing short of historic. In just under a year, the company went from being the face of corporate prejudice to the first airline in the world to earn the Zero Bias Airline certification, issued by the International Ethics in Aviation Commission, an organization notorious for setting the highest standards in the industry. Until then, no airline had passed the rigorous assessments, which included months of anonymous flight testing, employee interviews, AI-driven data audits, and customer experience simulations across class, race, age, gender, and disability spectrums. But Skylux, under immense pressure and public scrutiny, didn't just meet the standards, it exceeded them. The airline had implemented an internal ethics task force, mandated quarterly behavioral reviews, rewrote its hiring and promotion protocols to eliminate implicit bias, and installed Equinet's AI-backed monitoring tools that flagged microaggressions in customer interactions. These systems didn't just track complaints, they tracked tone, language, and body language using biometric feedback. Employees weren't just trained, they were transformed. The company invested over $50 million into the cultural rehabilitation process. What had once been a brand built on exclusivity had, astonishingly, become a symbol of inclusive excellence. But the true moment of global reflection didn't happen inside a boardroom or on a tarmac. It happened in Singapore, under the lights of the Global Tech and Ethics Forum, where Jasmine Crockett took the stage as keynote speaker. She didn't come dressed in the armor of a CEO. There was no designer logo, no bodyguard in the wings. Just her, elegant in a simple, structured gray suit, hair pinned neatly back, eyes calm but piercing. The auditorium, filled with over 2,000 of the world's most powerful thinkers, investors, and policymakers, fell into total silence as she approached the microphone. She stood still for a moment before she spoke, allowing the weight of her presence to settle over the room. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady, "I was escorted off a first-class flight by security for refusing to give up the seat I had paid for. No slideshow, no visuals, just words, sharp, clear, undeniable. I wasn't loud, I wasn't unruly, I wasn't out of line. I was simply inconvenient. I disrupted the comfort of a system that had grown too used to controlling who belongs where." A hush filled the hall. There was no need to reference the video. It had been watched by millions, dissected in universities, analyzed in corporate ethics seminars. Everyone in that room already knew the story. What they didn't know was what came next. "At first," Jasmine continued, "I thought justice meant reclaiming that seat, holding on to it like proof that I was right, that I belonged. And yes, that mattered. But as the months passed, as the world watched and the system trembled, I realized something deeper." She paused. The room leaned in. "Justice isn't just about sitting in the seat you paid for. Justice is when you use that seat, when you use that position, that privilege, that platform, to make sure others can sit in their seats, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or how the world tries to define them." The statement struck the room like lightning, not because it was loud, but because it was true. In that instant, Jasmine shifted the narrative from personal victory to systemic responsibility, from a moment of outrage to a blueprint for change. She wasn't speaking as a victim. She was speaking as a leader who had chosen to convert humiliation into transformation, not just for herself, but for an entire industry. She went on to detail how Equinet had partnered with Skylux, not only to rebuild trust, but to design a future where technology didn't just serve passengers, but protected them. AI simulations that identified discriminatory behavior in real time. Internal dashboards that tracked ethical KPIs. Feedback loops built not around convenience, but accountability. "We didn't just change a policy," she said. "We changed the architecture of the experience." Then came the moment no one would forget. At the close of her talk, Jasmine stepped away from the podium and walked to the edge of the stage. She looked out into the audience, scanning the faces. CEOs, regulators, engineers, senators. Then in a voice that dropped into silence like a verdict, she said, "Power isn't about keeping your seat. Power is what you do with it once you realize others still have to fight for theirs. You don't truly belong until everyone belongs." The applause didn't come immediately. It came slowly, like thunder rolling in after a storm, rising wave after wave until the room stood as one. Not just for her brilliance, not just for her bravery, but for the clarity she brought into the heart of a global conversation. That week, Skylux unveiled its new corporate slogan, no longer about luxury or legacy. It read, "We fly everyone." Short, simple, and finally true. And Jasmine? She didn't just take her seat back. She made it bigger until it had room for everyone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.